We're joined with the one and only Mark Sleboda, International Relations and Security Analyst. Mark, welcome to the show, man. How you doing this morning? Well, it's not morning for you, but how you doing today?
Jamaro, I'm alive. How are you? Thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on the show.
Oh, man, thank you. I'm alive too. My voice is a bit hoarse, but I am alive. I'm here and kicking.
A bit thoroughbred. A bit thoroughbred.
I try. So I was playing that clip of Mark Rutte. Mark Rutte pointed out that Russia is producing more in 3 months than all of NATO is producing in 1 year. And I was playing that clip in the context of another clip. This is Joe Biden. And I want to get your take on how do you reconcile these two things. Joe Biden is pointing out that the United States has spent $3 trillion. $1.3 trillion. And yet, all of NATO is being outproduced by Russia, by itself. I want to play this.
Investing almost $1.3 trillion for procurement, research, and development. In real dollars, that's more than America did in any 4-year period during the Cold War. We've also significantly strengthened the...
How do we reconcile that? The U.S. has spent $1.3 trillion in 4 years, and yet Mark Rutte is saying that Russia is outproducing all of NATO, meaning in 3 months, Russia is producing what NATO does in 1 year. How do we reconcile that amount of money spent without the return on investment? I hope you understand.
Okay, so yeah, first of all, it has to be said, to be specified that Mark Rutte's statements are that Russia is producing the armaments being used in this 3 times the amount of armaments being used in this conflict.
Right.
The U.S. And NATO produce lots of things that aren't useful for this conflict, right? But they're talking specifically the type of armaments that the Kiev regime needs. Artillery shells, tank, armored personnel carriers, missiles. That the sort of things that are being used in this conflict is a specific concept. Well, I would say that the American taxpayers deserve a very good attaboy slap on the back for the enormous steaming pile of pork that they have delivered for the military industrial complex in the United States. Yeah, for the producers of arms, for the war profiteers. Zelensky recently in an interview with a off-the-wall interview with Lex Friedman mentioned specifically the idea that only half of the money value of what the U.S. Promised the Ukraine has actually ended up in weapons in Ukraine, and then probably only half of that actually reaches the troops, if that. Anyway, but he's talking specifically about corruption in the United States. Well, that's true. I mean, that is it's not called corruption. It's called the price of doing business in the United States, and all of those costs, the amount of money that flows into the U.S. military industrial complex is part of the cost of doing business with the United States. It's taken for granted. Now you'll have a lot of politicians who will simply, this is a great deal. We're simply recycling money in the United States, right? As if, this is reaching into the dollars, into the pockets of every taxpayer,
right,
and then putting money back into the pockets of every American taxpayer, which is completely false, right? I mean, this is going to a very extremely small segment of American workers and a very wealthy set of the owners and shareholders of the U.S. military industrial complex. This is not some Keynesian recycling of wealth, that is just occurring. This is enriching, what I think many people, considering the uses that it is put to around the world, would be right in considering, some of the most moralist people on the earth. That they're not just building weapons for the defense of their country. They're building weapons for and foremost for profits, and second most for the pursuit of U.S. global hegemony around the world, right? Nothing at all to do with the actual defense of the continental United States or even U.S. treaty allies.
Yeah. No,
so
you're absolutely right.
So but it's also a testament to the way the two military industrial complexes diverged after the end of the Cold War. And the U.S. and to a lesser extent, the rest of the much smaller European military industrial complex moved to a completely for-profit, privatized, that promised basically they downsized what they didn't need for the conflicts of the 1990s and 2000s, which largely were counterterrorism, war on tribal Islam around the world, and high-end technological boondoggles like the littoral combat ship and the F-35. Meanwhile, things that are needed for actual warfare against a potential peer adversary, rather than, say, a bunch of guys running around in the desert with AK-47s, like artillery shells, like missiles, like these other things. They made grandiose promises, basically, of produce on demand. That's essentially what they were promising, and they lied, right?
Yeah.
They got rid of what is called surge capacity. Surge capacity is essentially productive facilities, but not only facilities, personnel, and downstream material components, everything that goes into making. Like when you make an artillery shell, you have to worry about lots of things, right? You have to worry about metal, you have to worry about TNT, explosive, whatever you're using for an explosive. You have to worry about cotton, which is part of the artillery shell, the padding. It's all sorts of things that go into, and you have to have each one of those components in mind, because if you lack any one of those, that holds up, of course, the whole production process. It's limited. Russia, meanwhile, did not have they had a partially privatized military industrial complex, but where the national interest always retained paramount, right? And they kept all of that surge capacity, which the West considered wasteful and inefficient after the Cold War. And not only did they keep it, but they kept it fairly modernized, right? So that it could be put back into use when needed. Why? Because Russia has always been preparing for this war, right? Because that is their private. They're not worried about hundreds of military bases ringing China on the other side, or another country on the other side of the world. They're preparing for the biggest existential threat, which is a land war coming from Europe, right? They've always been preparing for NATO, or some derivative of the United States coming at them from that direction. So they've been preparing for that war since before World War II ended, because that is the biggest security threat to Russia. So they had all of that surge capacity, right, to be put back into place. They had an educated workforce with technical skills that could be put to that, could rapidly be hired and put to that use. They had excess factories. They had, lines on all of the various material components they needed for this type of military production. They thought all of this out ahead of time. And so they were very quickly able to ramp up Russia's military industrial complex's production of artillery shells and missiles and ammunition and tanks and other things to levels that, I mean, Western politicians and generals, it must be said, jaws are still on the floor, right? They can't understand. It boggles their mind. It shatters their conception of the world that Russia, a country they have long wrongly derided as a gas station, or Nigeria with snow. No offense to the Nigerians. The only intense, I guess. Well, I guess it is offense to the Nigerians too, coming from the West, right? But that how can they possibly be outproducing, what they believe is the wealthiest and most industrious, and most innovative country in the world, and it's simply the fact that actually that's very little true right now. The U.S. transferred most of its manufacturing capacity out of the country, including for its own military-industrial complex, something the Pentagon is starting to realize now. During the 90s and the 2000s, during the golden age of globalization, right? Where it can be done cheaper because everything is for profit.
It's so crazy.
It has been a fatal flaw and a fatal overestimation by the United States of their own economy and military industrial complex, and a fatal underestimation of Russia's industrial capability in that regard. It's shattering people's conception of the U.S. place in the world, right? Which is really infuriating a lot of people, which is why they're so unwilling to acknowledge it, even as the facts of it are not only being played out on the battlefield, but are even laid out in print in publications like the New York Times and the Washington Post. And 15 minutes after they write it, they're back on old propaganda tropes, because even though they acknowledge it, it still doesn't change the narrative.
It doesn't sink in.
It doesn't penetrate the propaganda narrative, even when they themselves admit the facts.
Well, you heard, right?
That is very bad, because that affects decision making.
Well, your root just said, and like you said, in a few minutes there will be an article saying that Russia is running out of missiles. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the WAPO, even when they were talking about the condition that the Ukrainian military was in, they still would tend to stick a line in that, well, Russia's military is also
even worse.
Yeah, they're also bad off in this situation, even though we're talking about how bad off Ukrainian military is. You just heard the NATO Secretary General point out that Russia is outproducing them by 3 times over the course of a year. Look, I agree with you. That dichotomy still exists in publication, despite the fact that they would say stuff like this.
That's because the primary work of these publications is propaganda.
Yeah.
Right. It's not government directed propaganda. It's a fully, editorial line down to individual journalist buy-in to this delusional belief, because that is what the industry expects, right? You can't deliver bad news and change the narrative and start saying, well, we're losing this war, we should exit it. The political capacity of media to go against the U.S. government or other Western governments in this regard doesn't exist, right? Because there is a synergy between the corporate, quote unquote, free press and the government and the military industrial complex, that it's constantly feeding an incestuous feedback loop. And when you get most of these politicians, right, they're not getting their day-to-day narrative building, information from intelligence briefings, although some of them get those too. We know how badly intelligence in the United States is politicized, right? We've discovered that over the last 30 years. But on top of that, they're being fed their own propaganda and making bad foreign policy and military decision making on the misinformation that is being provided to them in that propaganda, which is why they keep getting Russia and China. How many articles have you read, right, by mainstream publications over the last 20 years that the Chinese economy is about to collapse, or that Vladimir Putin is either about to be overthrown, voted out of office, or die of some exotic disease? How
Yeah.
many times have you read that
Yeah.
over the last decade? When you start to think about how it just blips, because no one is ever held accountable for anything they say. But
Nope.
all the people who have told us over the last 3 years that Russia is running out of missiles, they're running out of tanks, they're running out of artillery shells, they're running out of rations, they're fighting using
morale.
shovels, they have
Yeah.
untrained, forced conscript, all of that, it's all lies. You are living in a carefully manufactured bubble of mainstream lies that still pretends as if it is the objective truth, and the Russians are the ones telling the propaganda.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's astonishing. It's astonishing. I don't know another word for it. You're absolutely right. Or the North Koreans, the newest one. The North Koreans are having wave attacks, and Zelensky killed a battalion of them, but the Russians burned their faces.
The North Koreans are burning their own faces and blowing
it's
themselves up with grenades to avoid capture. Okay, let's
just
address
so
this really quickly, because this finally, right after weeks of this teasing, well, these North Koreans, they can never be captured because they always burn themselves and kill themselves, and no one's ever seen them except from a distance where you can't make anything out, of course, or whatsoever. They finally captured 2 quote unquote North Koreans, right? Whom you will never hear speak, because these North Koreans are not North Koreans. They are Russian citizens, ethnic Tuvans from the Tuvan Republic. And because not everyone in Russia looks like me, right? They're not all white, brown, or blonde haired, right? Russia has 188 some just indigenous ethnicities, right? The number might actually be over 200, right?
Mm.
And multiple faiths. It's a multi-ethnic, multi-confessional federation, and there are lots of different types of Asian peoples. And if you take a look, right, if you know what you're looking for, right, it's this racist trope, right? That you hear constantly, right? All African-American people look alike. I can't tell the difference of them, right?
Yeah.
Can you? Same thing with all Asian or Asiatic people, right? They all look alike. They all look like North Koreans, right? These 2 people, they look nothing like North Koreans, right? I mean, except if you're completely blinded, with the racist worldview blinders here. They look like ethnic Tuvans from Russia. They've got documents, which even the Western media says, that admits that they are ethnic Tuvans with, the equivalent of a military card, right? It's actually a Russian military ticket. It's a card that tells who they are, where they're from, and everything. And then but that's just carefully constructed lies, right? That's all propaganda to hide the fact that they're North Koreans. Now, they've all delivered, right, written confessions that they're really from North Korea, right? You will never hear them speak North Korean or Korean, I should say, because they don't speak Korean. They speak Russian, right? Because they're Russian Tuvans. And these written confessions have either been manufactured or beat out of them. It is such a sad bit of propaganda. The saddest thing is you expect this from the Kiev regime, right? Because it has been part of the racist, Banderite, fascist propaganda, right, that dominates Kiev today since the 1930s. Right?
Yeah.
That Russia is the barbarian, Asiatic, Mongoloid hordes of Asia. And it is the fair Aryan, Slavic, Ukrainian people who are defending European civilization from those Mongoloid Muscovite hordes, right? That is chapter and verse. If you listen to what political figures, what military figures in the Kiev regime have said over the last 3 years, you have heard that again and again and again. And this is the culmination of all of that, right? This is actual Asiatic looking hordes, right? According to, this propaganda narrative. There's no reality to it. Russia and North Korea have signed a strategic partnership that includes a mutual defense clause very recently, like in the last couple of months. But they have not been doing military exercises together since before the end of the Cold War, right? They have no military interoperability. Yeah. Generally speaking, I mean, like to a very high degree, North Korean soldiers don't speak Russian and Russian soldiers don't speak Korean, right? They don't work together. Now they're going to start building that, which is why Russia and China have been doing military exercises basically every other month or more often for the last few years. It's why NATO, right? I've been, as a former U.S. military participant in lots of NATO military exercises, and I can tell you what a cluster F they always are because of the language barrier, right? And the institutional barrier, different practices in the militaries. And they've been practicing together for decades. Yeah, now, if the North Koreans were really involved in the Kursk region, right? I wouldn't give two figs. I wouldn't care. It makes no military sense, but I'm not averse to admitting that there were North Koreans fighting here. There's NATO people from NATO countries all over the Kiev regime forces and have been for the last 3 years. I would have no problem admitting it. The Russian war correspondent and blogosphere would be excited about it. They wouldn't be able to shut up about it if it was really happening because Russia would have a battlefield ally. Right, they'd be doing expose pictures. People, of course, don't believe that the Russian war media, operates like that. But for people who have been following it closely, who actually, speak some Russian, the Russian a war correspondent Telegram channel, social media, you have a lot more variety of opinion on those channels. You do anywhere in the Western media, it must be said. And I don't agree with many of them, but they're out there, right? And they wouldn't be able to shut up about this. So this is just more propaganda that, this myth that they have to keep getting more elaborate, hoaxes, more elaborate fictions generated to continue. Because the whole thing is meant to argue for more NATO support, more NATO intervention, NATO troops on the ground. How can you not send NATO troops? There's North Korean troops on the ground. Hey, let's bring in some South Korean troops as well, right? I mean, that's what this is all directed towards. There's none of it real. Look, there are some North Koreans in Russia, the largest country of the world, somewhere. Right? Yeah. Doing now, military academy and doing military exercises. And there's probably even a few of them behind the Russian lines observing what the Russians are doing with logistics and artillery and the like, because it's valuable military experience that very few countries in the world have, right? Against the US certainly doesn't have it against a peer adversary. But there are not North Korean troops involved in the special military operation. I have seen no evidence, and I wouldn't be against. I wouldn't say it would make much military sense, but simply in political terms, I wouldn't care if they were, and most Russians wouldn't care if they were. But I'd be fair enough. If I see real evidence that I believe there's North Korean troops fighting on the ground in Kursk or anywhere else in the SMO, I'll be the first to come on and say, look, the facts have changed. There's now real evidence. Everything that the Kiev regime has presented is not evidence. It's clearly, easily debunked and often rooted in racism propaganda.
Yeah, I agree. I have seen no evidence of battalions of North Koreans being mowed down.
Jamal, let me ask you. There was a video that was circulating around in the last 2 weeks.
I saw it.
The video of the Tuvan, of a Russian ethnic Tuvan. Was he Tuvan or Yakut? Yakut. Tuvan with the knife.
No.
Yakut. Okay, Yakut. They were Yakut. They were.
Okay.
The soldier was from Yakutia, which is also in Siberia, an Asiatic looking, but definitely does not look North Korean. Russian soldier who got involved in a close quarter combat.
Knife fight. I saw that.
That got down to a knife fight with a Ukrainian soldier who was wearing a helmet cam.
He said,
And
"Let me
it
die."
is one of the most awful, I mean, heart-wrenching, it's definitely, all right, don't show this to your kids, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot that you can't see, but I mean, you can definitely see blood and lots of screaming and
Stabbing.
really desperate fight for life between two men. And it ended up with the Russian Yakut soldier winning, and actually some words of respect as the other one was dying. You were the best warrior. Let me die in peace, and then he left him a grenade to finish himself off with, that sort of thing. It was remarkable in the interviews with this Yakut soldier elsewhere, which of course you won't hear in the Western media, but are in Russian media. The man was, I mean, he kept talking about the most difficult thing and the most important thing, because he's been wounded several times in several other incidences, is to maintain your humanity. He kept talking about that. Anyway, the point is that this was an Asian ethnic Russian who defeated a white Aryanish Ukrainian soldier, and the response from the Kiev regime, favorable social media, was just disgust. Why? Because their white Ukrainian soldier was built by a Russian mongrel Asian, right? And that the similarity thus between these two events, right? One with two captured Tuvan Russians, one with another. It's just points to a whole general character of how the Kiev regime's military forces treat ethnic Russians. I mean, Russians who are shall we say, great ethnic Russian, who are Asians and Caucasian and all of these other hundreds of wonderful, interesting ethnicities that make Russia up. I think a lot of Western right-leaning people whom are pro-Russia have a very distorted vision of what Russia and Russians are, that is tied into their own racist beliefs, maybe, that Russia is some type of ideal white European Christian country. And the reality is so much richer and so much more complex than that.
Yeah, Russia's huge. It's just as a landmass, it's massive by itself. But I have to get your take on this. This came out, I believe, this morning. At least I saw it this morning. Trump's Middle East envoy forced Netanyahu to accept a Gaza deal he repeatedly rejected. Now, there are all sorts of commercials on this page that Haaretz is basically trying to make as much money as they can. But putting that to the side, last Friday evening, still Witkoff, U.S. President Donald Trump's
remote jobs hiring urgently. Could you follow that link, John?
Yeah. So basically, long story short, it says that the envoy pushed Netanyahu to accept the deal. And I mean, was somewhat boisterous in doing so. Netanyahu initially was like, "Oh, I'm not going to be here because this is the Sabbath." The guy tells him, "I don't really care about the Sabbath. I'm here to make a deal. We need to get this straight." And that effectively, this kind of deal that Hamas was willing to accept going all the way back for the last, 8 months, that Netanyahu under no circumstances would accept, that he is now apparently open to accepting. Now, this is, of course, going to have to go through any kind of channels in Israel, like, I guess, Knesset or something like that. But one of the other interesting parts is that on a Channel 4 interview, they point out that Trump effectively forced them to take the deal. So right here, this is Netanyahu's Errol Sigal. He laments, "We were the first to pay the price for Trump's election. The deal is being forced upon us. We thought we'd take control of northern Gaza, that they'd let us impede humanitarian aid. And Trump is not letting us do that." Give me your thoughts on this. I mean, and if this is correct, it points out how weak, pointless Joe Biden was. Jack Blue had an interview with Times of Israel and effectively said what everybody who was paying attention to it knew, that Joe Biden wasn't really putting any roadblocks on anything. That anything that Israel wanted to do, Joe Biden effectively let them do it without any pressure coming from the White House. It seems that Trump is putting pressure and it's not even in the White House. Give me your thoughts.
Okay, so first of all, I have to say that this is all, of course, unofficial, right?
Mhm.
This is the Trump administration has not taken power yet. Any power that they may be exerting behind the scene has not been verified with any facts on the ground.
That's true.
Right? This is things that are being whispered about in the back pages of the Western media at this point, in particular the Israeli media. And I'm not quite sure that the Trump elect team has quite that much power, right? Yet. That's
You don't
why
think so? I think so. But go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm not saying yes, and I'm not saying no. I'm saying not enough evidence yet, right?
Okay,
I'm just
fair
putting a big question mark where everything is in doubt, because we have heard multiple times before about Netanyahu agreeing to various ceasefires over the last 2 years. I've lost count of how many times,
Right.
and none of them have proven to be true, right?
That's true.
None of them, right? None of them. So that's simply why I'm saying not enough yet, right? I wasn't fooled by any of those because I didn't believe any of them at the time, but I know lots of good intentioned people who immediately jumped on those previous rumors of ceasefires and that Netanyahu had agreed to it because they wanted to believe it was true, right? I want to believe it's true too, but I'm too much of a black pillar to accept anything, a cynic and a black pillar, until I see actual evidence. This is simply why I'm saying it may be true, but let's be cautious in our regard to it, right? But I've seen enough points of evidence right now that tell me that the relation between the Trump administration and the Netanyahu regime in Israel are going to be a lot more complicated than a lot of people, including me, have thought up until this point, and maybe much more complicated than during the first Trump administration.
Agreed.
Right? Now, again, we always have to fall back because we do have a precedent for a Trump foreign policy, right? Which was 100% pro-Israel during the last Trump administration. So we have to exercise caution in our expectations of divergence from that. That's all I'm saying. Again, but there's some interesting facts. Another one of those that has come out in the Israeli media that is not, as far as I can see, being widely discussed in the U.S. media, is that a account, right, an official Trump social media account on Truth Social, whether this was actually Donald Trump is another question, right? But posted a video, restacked, reposted, retweeted, whatever you want to call it, on Truth Social. I don't know what they call it there. I've never accessed that site myself. A video with Jeffrey Sachs, right? The professor, I think he's at Stanford, right? We all know Jeffrey Sachs. He has become a Damascene conversion, serious critic of U.S. hegemony around the world, right? And he has very widely spoken negative criticisms of Israel, of the Israeli government, of U.S. policy under Joe Biden and elsewhere. But Trump reposted this. And this has everyone doing a double take, right? Including me, saying, wow, did Trump himself really post this? Or is this some indication of the people that Trump is starting to listen to now? If so, that's something new. That is something interesting, and it is such it is so anti-heretical to orthodox U.S. foreign policy that you really have to imagine that there's some CIA agents, doing assassination practice right now. I mean, because the deep state cannot let someone who listens to Jeffrey Sachs and takes what he says seriously sit in the Oval Office for long.
By the way, how do you place that? I got to be honest. I could not frame that at all. I mean, because up to this point, I mean, for one, he gets like $100 million from Adelson to effectively do whatever she wants for Israel's best interest.
And the
people,
widow,
and the people that he was putting in his administration have been just vultures, right?
Mike Waltz, Exit, Rubio.
Yeah, these people are sociopaths. And so, the thought is Trump was going to be completely obsequious to whatever Israel wants, despite him telling Muslims, I'm going to end this war. I'm going to end this war. We assumed that he was just going to follow policy. And so when I saw that video, I had no idea where to place that. And then when the information comes out that Donald Trump was effectively bullying Netanyahu to take a deal. Now, the reason why I was more open to Trump potentially doing this is because I don't get the sense that Trump is going to allow himself to be humiliated in the way that Joe Biden allowed himself to be humiliated. Meaning, even if Joe Biden behind the scenes, go for it.
Joe Biden was a walking Weekend at Bernie's corpse, right? Yeah. We know that. Exactly. It's been finally admitted, right? We were talking about it for more than a year, right? Right. But finally, the Western mainstream media has grudgingly admitted that it was all true, right? And all of their censorship of us on social media and everywhere else of Joe Biden's fading mental and physical health. Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan were running, and a few others, right? Close inner circles were running the country. And in particular, you have to believe that Anthony Blinken was rolling the roost on U.S. foreign policy on Israel. And as he appeared in Israel, right, standing with officials, I'm not sure if it was actually Netanyahu who he was standing next to, but he says, I'm here not only as a U.S. citizen, but as a man of Jewish faith, right? Yep. As a Jew, right? First of all, I have to say, the last time I checked, there's lots of Jews out there in the world that don't agree with the government of Israel, right? And that is an incredible act of anti-Semitism to assume that all Jews out there agree with the genocidal policies of the Israeli government. There is no greater act of anti-Semitism than to try to jump all Jews just because they are Jews, like Anthony Blinken insinuated when he was making those comments.
What you're pointing to is foreign allegiance, that they don't have an allegiance to their own governments. They have this kind of always this foreign allegiance.
Overarching, right? And that is not true of all Jewish people, right? It is obviously true of Anthony Blinken. Right. And that's why every time you hear that, the Biden was a pushover. Biden was a walking Weekend at Bernie's corpse, and it was Blinken and Sullivan who were agreeing to everything that Netanyahu wanted, right? Even when they had to make hand-wringing noises. Those poor Gazan civilians. Here's a few more bombs, right? Yeah. All of this stuff that was, you bad Netanyahu, slap your, maybe just with one finger, slap your wrist, right? This was all going on at the same time. And it's so transparently deceitful, right? And there's not even an ounce of credibility in the U.S. And the fact, again, that the Western mainstream media didn't say, hey, they're increasing the arms shipments and the satellite targeting and everything they're telling us is complete BS, right? And transparently so. Again, it is such a condemnation of the Western media and journalists as a whole that none of them called the Biden administration on what they were doing, right? Again, if you want to call it outright as what Sullivan and Blinken were doing to
Matthew
aid
Miller.
Netanyahu.
Make sure you add that sociopath. Miller was just as bad. I mean, he was, Matthew Miller was horrible. I mean, somebody and you're right, it was so transparent. Like, it wasn't even clever. It was just lies, and it was shameless lies. They were being
every one of your audience out there knows that it was shameless lies, right?
Yeah.
Even the ones that don't want to admit it knew it was shameless lies.
I want to close this. I guess closing where we began. Sanctions. So Joe Biden has put in what I call the nuclear option of sanctions, going after energy, even energy being transported by boat, even going after, I think it was like 186 boats or ships that were apparently a part of this quote unquote shadow fleet, as Joe Biden.
What are we on, Babylon 5?
Right.
Shadow Fleet? Right. We're on Babylon 5, right? Shadow Fleet, right, is the word they use to describe Russian corporate-owned tankers, right, that do not get insurance from London and therefore are not under the direct control of the United States, right? That is,
I love that.
Is shadow like is everything Russian going to be shadow now? Right?
Or if you don't get it from the UK, then by definition it is in the black. It's in the dark.
Let me try this. How does Mark Shadow Sleboda? Right.
Right.
My shadow crows. It's so absurd. Anyway, so I don't actually agree that this is a nuclear option. I think it's I think it's going to be mostly a damn squib, right? So they've extended sanctions against two significant Russian oil firms that they haven't before, right? Gazprom Neft, right, which is Gazprom's oil, and Surgut Neftegas, right? And they've also put individual sanctions on 183 or 186 of Russia.
180 something.
Yeah, out of Russia's 600 tanker fleet, right, of shadow tankers, right?
So why did they pick just 180 as opposed to all of them?
They're going specifically after ones that they have a lot of evidence against and that are probably going to China and India, right? They're right. So, but this is a game of whack-a-mole, right? These tankers will be sold. Russia will buy new ones. The oil will be transferred at sea, as is often done, so they don't never have to go into port anyway. This is at most a short-term, all right, interruption, a short-term inconvenience for Russia. Russia has been preparing for these sanctions for a long time. They'll dealt with it like they've done around it. India just signed an enormous 10-year deal of huge supplies of oil from Russia. They don't care about it. They're going to work on the workarounds, just like China and everyone else. This is at most. And in return for this inconvenience, it will cost Russian oil companies some revenue and thus the Russian government some taxes in the short term as they work out the workarounds, right? But that's also already pushing the global price of oil above $81 a barrel. This has been the whole problem all along in sanctioning the world's biggest commodity supplier, because you try to rake away their profits and putting sanctions on there, and all that does is mean that they make more money on the oil that they do sell. Right? You can see where that leads to internal contradictions. Ultimately, yes, okay, so there will be some revenue lost in the short term with workarounds, but ultimately all it will do is insulate the Russian economy further from future Western sanctions, right? And their ability in the regard. And it is going to raise prices, right, on oil, which means inflation, for you out there listening to this, you are going to bear the brunt of the cost, because that is the way the global energy market always works, is that the end user will pay ultimately for the majority of the costs of interruptions of supply and distribution. And Joe Biden himself admitted in an interview that it could backfire, and that American citizens will probably experience a 3 or 4 cent rise in the price of gasoline. It's going to be a lot higher than that if these sanctions are continued on this. And Trump may just throw them out. Let's be perfectly honest about that. They're trying to talk about, oh, it will be difficult for him to throw it out. No, it won't. That's actually false, because this is being done with an executive order. And while there are ways for Congress to overrule an executive order change by the president, they are very severe. It's like trying to impeach a president. It is not easy to do. And that's not going to happen with Trump, with the new Congress coming in. They could resist him on other things with sanctions in the future. But when he comes right out and says, these sanctions are just going to hurt American consumers and they're not going to hurt Russia that much, and American consumers don't need any more inflation at this point, no one is going, well, some Democrats will argue, right? Lindsey Graham will argue, but not enough people. So Trump will, if he so desires, be able to throw these sanctions out right away. And if he doesn't, Russia has long been prepared for this, right? And like I said, short-term interruption, that's the most they're going to get out of it.
And just to back you up further, Jen Psaki agrees with you. This was during the first time around when Joe Biden passed those sanctions. And Jen Psaki is being asked, hey, is this going to hit Americans? Listen to what she says back then, because it applies to what's happening today.
Well, I think, again, Peter, and as I said to Weijia, I mean, some of this depends on what President Putin does. So as he's suggesting what the impact will be around the world, it's all based on what his actions are, just to be very clear about it. What the president is focused on and is working on is taking every step we can to communicate with, coordinate with, engage with big global suppliers around the world to minimize the impact on the energy markets.
But even without all this going on, gas in California is almost $5 a gallon. Should people across the country expect to see that kind of a number when they
blame Putin? Blame Putin.
$6.
Well, again, I think, as you heard the president say last week, standing up for our values is not without cost.
Love that. Standing up for our values is not without cost. We got to pay for our values. We got to pay for our values.
That's Jen Psaki. The ruble is rubble. Jen, the ruble is rubble Psaki. Right? I'm not a more honest. I have so much veracity from that woman. Yeah. Just we got
to pay for our values. I love that. We got to pay for our values. All right, I'll close it on this. One last question: where are we on the battlefield, Mark? And we can end it on this.
Yeah, I mean, right now things are really bad for the Kiev regime. Right, it continues to be an operational crisis. The word now, first of all, Toretsk fell under Russian control last week. Again, not officially yet, but for all intents and purposes, it will probably be announced by the Russian Ministry of Defense. Chasiv Yar, big breakthroughs there as well. And expect Chasiv Yar to be wrapped up similarly. There's already analysts saying on both sides saying, yeah, Chasiv Yar is game over. It was a long, hard fight, right? The Kiev regime threw everything into it. But that is going to mean that Russia is going to move on this last defensive line, right, at the tail end of it on Konstantinovka within the next 2 months, right? Pokrovsk is encircled. The Kursk incursion, this Kursk 1.2 Fool's Crusade completely failed, right? But again, the Kiev regime does have forces for more significant counterattacks or an actual suicidal offensive, maybe towards Bryansk or Zaporozhye. But the weather right now, the weather for the last 2 weeks, right, and probably for the next week in Ukraine has been above zero, right? And that means that it's terrible offensive weather, right, for anything, taking tanks and things off. So whatever offensive plans they really had, and I believe that this counterattack billed as an offensive in Kursk was just a distraction or a prelude or something of the sort. But whatever other plans they have is on pause, primarily because it's really bad weather. But expect, if the temperatures drop below, say, minus 10 Celsius, 10 degrees below freezing, for more than 2 weeks, that is when you should expect to see big offensive pushes by either side. But again, the Kiev regime is not done yet, and they've stood up 14 new brigades. How willing they are to fight is an open question. But they've been equipped by the U.S. and Australia and Germany and other countries, and they have not appeared in significant levels yet on the battlefield. It will still be another suicidal offensive like the Kursk one, but the bottom line is they're not done yet. This isn't over.
Mark
They're not going to
Sleboda.
win, but it's not over.
Mark Sleboda, international relations and security analyst. You can follow Mark on Twitter at Mark Sleboda1. You can also find him on YouTube at Realpolitik with Mark Sleboda. And of course, on Facebook at facebook.com/Gramsci. Mark, man, you always have my deepest appreciation. Thank you for this, man. I really do appreciate it.
Joel, thanks for having me.
You have a good one, man.